Hello everyone and welcome again to the SQL course. So here we are in a new chapter on our SQL for Absolute Beginners course. We are now entering an exciting new part, which is the part where we are going to combine tables. So this is one of the most common usages of SQL, and I think where most of the confusion may start to appear when you are dealing with SQL, because it's sometimes lectured a bit fast, and I think that we will spend a lot of time here in this course to really understand this concept, and we'll spend some time really understanding how these joins and union operators work. First, we'll understand how we can join tables using a common key to expand our table with new columns or restrain the domain. You'll understand what this means in a minute. And then we'll understand how we can use union operators to also concatenate our tables one on top of the other. Those are a bit more simple, the union operators. The joins are, of course, the ones that are a bit more challenging at the beginning, but as soon as you get the hang of them, you'll understand that they are extremely simple and they are a really cool concept here in SQL. So you might have heard about joins somewhere in your life. So left join, right join, inner join, these are some of the most common usages in terms of joins that you might have heard someone from IT or databases talk about. This is because this is a central concept here in SQL and in databases in general. These are one of the main ways for us to connect different databases, and let's jump right into some example that will let us understand what this means. Now you can find the scripts that we are going to use in this part on chapter number 5 in the course materials. So if you go here, SQL for Absolute Beginners, 5 combining tables, that's where you will find all the scripts that we will look at in this section. Now we'll return to work with the Sequila database. Again, now that we are not going to create our own tables, it makes sense for us to return to the table that we are most familiar with. We are also going to do some examples with our own created tables. So don't forget, first to start this, let's connect to our database system or server. Okay, so let me start by doing one thing, which is going here for our Sequila database and select just 2 columns, the rental ID and the customer ID from the Sequila.rental. So this is a new table that we haven't explored yet, but it's a really simple table that just has the information about the rentals that the customer has done, a specific customer. For example, customer 1 has rented all these movies with these IDs. Just subset these 2 columns with a purpose, which is if I have this information and we don't have the name of the customer in the rental table, I may want to know the name of the customer. For example, does it make sense if I'm doing this for a specific customer and I want to call him, for example, to give him more information about the rentals that he has done, does it make sense to treat him as customer ID 1? So on the phone, like, hey, customer ID 1, how are you? I've seen that you've rented these movies in the past, blah, 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 blah. Doesn't make sense. We want to have the name of the customer here. So what would be an easy way for us to get the name of the customer? We would have to have some table that would give us this decodification of the name. So we would have customer ID 1 is a specific name. We have that table because if I go to the select all from Sequila.customer, I'll have the information about my customers. For example, here I know that this is Mary Smith. It is my customer, it's the name of my customer. Of course, if you would do this by your own for every row by hand, it would be extremely cumbersome. We would like to combine both of these tables in some way. Have the customer ID, have the rental ID of the movie, and have the first and the last name of our customer. So what we can do is then combine these tables using a join. Basically, a join is for us to use some specific column to get more data to a specific table, in this case additional columns. We can also do domain restriction, as we will see next, but mostly the usage of joins is to do this, to pick up using a common key, picking up data that is on another table based on a specific column. As an example, I know that the connector between these 2 tables will be the customer ID. So if I go here, I know that I have customer ID on the table on the left. Let's start to use these terms and you'll understand why. The table on the left, which is the Sequila.rental, I'll have a customer ID. The table on the right, I also have a customer ID. And the table on the right, we'll call the Sequila.customer. So I'm going to do the following. I'm going to start with the select statement, customer ID, and then I know that I'll have the following. I know that I want the rental ID, and I know that I want the first name and the last name. Of course, if I just use sakila.customer on the table on the right, let's call it in this way, I'll have an error because the rental ID is not in this table customer. And if I do the opposite, if I go to the rental and run this one, I have an error because the first name and also last name, but the first name is the first that we have right here, is not on this rental table. And I want to combine them. So what I can do is do a new syntax, which is the inner join. And I'm going to do after the from. So the inner join will enable me to connect two tables based on the common key. Now I know that I want to connect the sakila.rental with the sakila.customer. And I have a new syntax afterwards, on. And you might imagine what comes on the on. It's the key that is going to connect both of these tables. So I can go customer ID equals customer ID. There is still a small issue here with this query because the customer ID is not referenced from what table I want to use the customer ID from. So if I want to connect the customer ID from the left table with the right table, I must name that customer ID. And this is where the alias enter, because here I'm going to use the power of the alias to name what is the customer ID that I'm going to equal to what customer ID. For example, if I run this as it is, I'll have a mistake because the column customer ID is ambiguous. What this means is that this column is on both tables. So as I only reference it as customer ID, SQL doesn't really know which of the customer ID I'm referencing. Okay, so I need to reference which table I want the customer ID. And let's call this in this way. So this will be the left table. I'm going to call it with this alias. And this will be the right table. Now notice, I'm doing an alias after the inner join. This is also enabled by SQL. I can do alias on the table that's on the from, as we've learned in the first section of the course. And I can also do the alias on the table that's going to be connected with this one. So now what I can do is, for example, name in my columns where I want the column to come from. I only have to do this in the ambiguous columns, of course, in the columns that are repeated, in this case the connectors that are repeated in the tables. The other ones don't need that because SQL knows where it's going to pick up that column from, because there's only one of those tables that have that column. So here I'm going to say left table. Of course, for this example, it's completely the same if I use left table here .customer or right table .customer, because both of the tables have all the customer IDs. This doesn't happen in some of the cases, and in left joins and right joins, what you put here really does matter, and we'll see that in a couple of lectures. These ones don't need to have the table that I want to reference from, because rental ID is only on this one, first name and last name is only on this one, so they are not ambiguous columns, they are not on the two tables. And also here on the join, this will still lead to some ambiguity, because this column, again, is on both tables and I need to reference which one of them I'm referencing. And of course here I want to equal the customer ID from the left table with the customer ID of the right table, because I'm doing a join between both tables. I can also put here the right table. For example, I can also call that column, but this will be a duplicated column because this is exactly the same information in both of the tables. So let me run this one, and as you will see, something almost magical happens, which is really cool. So you have, for example, customer ID will be exactly the same, these two customer IDs, and then we'll have the rental ID and the first name of this customer, the customer ID 1, and the last name of this customer. Now we have already information in the same table of the rental IDs that Mary Smith has done. And if I go here, start with Linda Williams, these are the rental movies that also Linda Williams has done in this case. So this was super cool because now we were able to augment our table, and this augmentation enabled us to bring more columns to our table.